Picture this. It's 15,000 years ago. There's no alarm clock, no phone buzzing on the nightstand, no little voice yelling, just 5 more minutes, while you slap around blindly, trying to find a snooze button that doesn't exist yet. And yet somehow, our ancestors were up before sunrise, hunting, gathering, building, surviving, without a single mechanical device telling them what time it was. So here's the question that's going to bother you for the rest of this video. How on earth did they do it? How did people wake up on time in a world that didn't even have the concept of time the way we think about it? Because here's the thing, we treat waking up on time like a modern problem. We complain about our alarms, we hit snooze, we blame our phones for keeping us up too late scrolling. But the truth is, waking up at a consistent, useful hour is a problem every single human society has had to solve, in every era, with whatever tools they had lying around. And some of the solutions our ancestors came up with are so clever, so weirdly specific, that they make your iPhone alarm look lazy by comparison. By the end of this video, you're going to understand something most people never think about, that your body is not actually relying on your alarm clock nearly as much as you think it is. You have an ancient system running in the background of your biology right now, one that's been fine-tuned over millions of years of evolution, and understanding how it worked for our ancestors might just explain why your modern alarm clock is fighting a losing battle every single morning. Let's start at the very beginning, because the first alarm clock humans ever had wasn't an object. It was a star, the sun. For the overwhelming majority of human history, waking up on time simply meant waking up when it got light. That's it. That was the whole system. And this wasn't some primitive workaround either. It was actually deeply tied into how our bodies are built. Every cell in your body runs on something called a circadian rhythm, a roughly 24-hour internal clock that governs everything from your body temperature to your hormone release to when you feel hungry and when you feel sleepy. And the master conductor of this entire orchestra sits in a tiny cluster of neurons in your brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Don't worry, there's no quiz later. Just know that this little cluster is basically your body's built-in timekeeper, and it takes its cues directly from light hitting your eyes. When light hits your retina in the morning, it sends a signal straight to this internal clock, which then tells your body to stop producing melatonin, the hormone that makes you feel drowsy, and start ramping up cortisol, which gives you that alert, ready-to-go feeling. This is why, even today, if you've ever camped outside without a phone or a watch, you've probably noticed you wake up naturally not long after sunrise, whether you wanted to or not. That's not a coincidence. That's tens of thousands of years of biological programming kicking in the moment you remove the artificial noise of modern life. So for early humans, the sun wasn't just a light source. It was the original alarm clock, and it was remarkably reliable. It rose at a predictable time depending on the season, it flooded their sleeping spaces with light, and their bodies were already wired to respond to it. In fact, some researchers who've studied hunter-gatherer societies that still exist today, groups like the Hadza in Tanzania or the San people in the Kalahari, have found that these communities tend to wake up shortly before sunrise and fall asleep a few hours after sunset, almost like clockwork, without needing any device at all. Their sleep is regulated almost entirely by ambient light and temperature. As the night cools down toward dawn, that temperature drop actually plays a role in waking the body up, too, alongside the light. But here's where it gets interesting, because waking up with the sun works great if all you need to do is wake up eventually. It's a much bigger problem if you need to wake up at a specific time, in the dark, before the sun even comes up. And ancient humans absolutely had reasons to do that. Hunters needed to leave before dawn to catch animals that were most active or most vulnerable in the early morning hours. Fishermen needed to catch tides that had nothing to do with sunrise. Farmers needed to beat the heat of the day. So the moment, human societies needed precision earlier than whenever the sky brightens. They had to get creative. And that's where the animal kingdom stepped in to help. Enter the rooster, the original biological alarm clock, and honestly, one of the most underrated inventions in human history. Except nobody invented it. Humans just figured out how to exploit an animal that was already doing this on its own. Roosters crow before dawn because they too have an internal circadian clock. And interestingly, scientists have found that a rooster's crow isn't purely a response to seeing light. Researchers in Japan actually ran an experiment where they kept roosters in constant dim light with no clear day-night cycle, and the roosters still crowed at roughly the same time each cycle, proving their crowing is driven by an internal clock, not just external light. Early farming societies figured this out empirically, without any of the science, simply by noticing that roosters were suspiciously punctual. So they started keeping them specifically for this purpose, not just for eggs or meat, but as a functional wake-up system. If you had a rooster, you had a built-in alarm that would go off reliably every single day, whether you liked it or not. And it wasn't only roosters. Different cultures leaned on whatever animals were loud and predictable in their environment. In some regions, people relied on specific birds known to call out consistently at certain hours. Even domesticated dogs, tuned into their owners' routines and the sounds of the surrounding environment, would often stir and rouse their households around the same time each day. Nature, it turns out, is full of built-in alarm clocks. Humans just had to learn to listen. But relying on animals still has an obvious flaw. What if you need to wake up at a time that has nothing to do with sunrise or a rooster's internal clock? What if you're a monk who needs to pray at a specific hour in the middle of the night? What if you're a soldier who needs to wake exactly when a shift change happens, regardless of the season? This is where ancient humans started building actual devices, and honestly, some of these are so ingenious you're going to wonder why we ever needed batteries in the first place. Let's talk about water clocks, because these things are wild. The ancient Egyptians and later the Greeks developed a device called a clepsydra, which is essentially a container with a small hole that lets water drip out at a steady, controlled rate. As the water level dropped, it would mark the passage of time, kind of like an hourglass but with liquid instead of sand. Now, on their own, water clocks don't wake you up. They just tell you what time it is if you're awake to check them. But ancient engineers figured out how to weaponize this concept into an actual alarm. Some versions of these water clocks were rigged so that once the water reached a certain level, it would trigger a mechanism, sometimes causing a small ball or pebble to drop onto a metal plate or a gong, creating a loud noise at a precise, predetermined time. Essentially, ancient humans built a self-triggering alarm clock using nothing but gravity, water, and clever engineering thousands of years before electricity existed. Plato himself is said to have used a variation of this device to wake his students up on time for lectures at dawn. Just picture that for a second. One of the most important philosophers in human history sitting there going, you know what my students need? A wake-up call. And so he allegedly had a water-based alarm built specifically to make sure nobody slept through his lecture. If that's not the most relatable thing you've heard about ancient Greece, I don't know what is. Moving further east, ancient Chinese civilizations developed something arguably even more elegant: incense clocks. These worked by burning incense along a carefully measured trail, sometimes shaped in a spiral or a straight line, sometimes with threads tied at specific intervals with small weights attached, or even small metal balls resting above the incense. As the incense burned down and reached those threads, the thread would burn through, and the weight or ball would drop, making a sound loud enough to wake someone up. This meant you could essentially set your alarm by choosing how long a stick of incense was, since these were often calibrated to burn for a specific known duration. Certain temples used massive versions of these incense clocks not just to wake individuals, but to regulate entire daily schedules for dozens or even hundreds of monks, marking hours for prayer, meals, and rest, all without a single gear or spring. And speaking of monks, religious life in general has some of the most fascinating early alarm clock history you'll find anywhere, because monks had an extremely strict problem to solve. Many monastic traditions required prayer at very specific hours throughout the night, hours that had nothing to do with sunrise, sunset, or any animal's natural rhythm. So monks had to get inventive, and one of history's most charming solutions to this problem was, quite literally, another human being. In medieval Europe, monasteries would assign a monk the specific job of staying awake through the night and waking the others at the correct hour for prayer. This role sometimes involved walking through the sleeping quarters with a candle or a bell, physically checking that everyone was up. In some monasteries, they used a rope with a knot tied at a specific length that would be timed to burn down like a fuse, similar in spirit to the incense clocks, letting the night watch monk know precisely when to start his rounds. This idea of a designated human alarm clock wasn't limited to religious life either. It shows up again much later in a wonderfully specific historical job that a lot of people have never heard of. During the Industrial Revolution in Britain, factory workers needed to wake up at extremely precise hours to make their shifts, and cheap, reliable mechanical alarm clocks weren't yet widely available to working-class families. So an entire profession sprang up to fill the gap: the knocker-upper. Yes, that was a real, actual job title, and I promise I'm not making it up. A knocker-upper would walk the streets in the early morning hours carrying a long stick, sometimes tipped with wire or stiff bristles, and would tap on the windows of their clients' bedrooms, specifically the upper floor windows where people slept, until they heard signs that the person had woken up. Some knocker-uppers used pea shooters instead, literally firing dried peas at windows to wake people without having to reach all the way up with a stick. This job persisted in parts of Britain well into the 1970s in some rural areas, existing right alongside modern electric alarm clocks, because for some people, a human being tapping on your window was simply more reliable than an early, unreliable electric device. Now here's a detail that tends to blow people's minds a little, because it flips a common assumption about ancient sleep on its head. A lot of people today assume that ancient humans, without artificial light, just slept straight through the night in one solid block, the way modern sleep hygiene experts tell us we should. But historical evidence actually points to something much stranger, called segmented sleep, or biphasic sleep. Historian Roger E. Kirch, who spent years digging through old diaries, court records, and literature from pre-industrial Europe, found hundreds of references to what people at the time called first sleep and second sleep. The pattern went something like this. People would go to bed a couple of hours after sunset, sleep for around 3 or 4 hours, then wake up naturally in the middle of the night for an hour or two. During this waking period, people would do all sorts of things: pray, chat with a bedmate, tend to small chores, even visit neighbors, before going back down for a second sleep until sunrise. This wasn't considered unusual or a sign of insomnia at all. It was just how sleep worked before artificial lighting extended people's evenings and pushed bedtimes later, compressing sleep into a single continuous block, the pattern we now consider normal. Some sleep researchers have even run experiments depriving modern participants of artificial light for weeks at a time, and found their sleep naturally split into 2 segments, remarkably similar to the historical pattern Kirch described. So, in a strange way, waking up in the middle of the night that we now associate with poor sleep might actually be our biology reverting to a much older, much more natural default, one that humans followed for the vast majority of our history before electric light rewired the whole system. This matters for our alarm clock story too, because it changes the entire framing of what waking up on time even meant to ancient humans. It wasn't just about one single moment in the morning. Their relationship with waking and sleeping was woven throughout the entire night, guided by natural light, temperature shifts, and internal biological cues, rather than being bookended by a single jarring noise at one fixed hour like we experience today. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Now let's fast forward and talk about how we eventually got from incense sticks and knocker-uppers to the mechanical alarm clocks we're more familiar with, because this transition tells you a lot about how obsessed humans have always been with solving this exact problem. The first known mechanical alarm clock is often credited to a Greek engineer named Ctesibius, working around the 3rd century BCE in Alexandria, who improved on the water clock concept by adding mechanisms that could produce a whistling sound or drop pebbles onto a gong at a set time, essentially building on those older Greek water alarm designs but making them more precise and repeatable. Centuries later in medieval Europe, large mechanical tower clocks in monasteries and town centers were sometimes fitted with alarm mechanisms specifically to wake the person responsible for ringing the bells that would then wake everyone else, creating this almost comedic chain reaction where one alarm's entire job was to wake up the human being in charge of the town's actual public alarm system. The personal, portable mechanical alarm clock, as we'd recognize it, didn't really show up until the 15th century, when a clockmaker in Germany is credited with creating an early spring-driven alarm clock. Though these were expensive, rare, and typically owned only by the wealthy or by institutions. It wasn't until the Industrial Revolution, with mass production techniques and cheaper materials, that alarm clocks became affordable enough for ordinary households. Which is exactly why professions like the knocker-upper persisted for so long even after mechanical clocks technically existed. Owning one was a luxury for a long time, not a guarantee. There's something almost poetic about this whole timeline when you really sit with it. For the vast majority of human existence, waking up on time wasn't outsourced to a device at all. It was a deeply social and biological process, involving your own internal clock synced to sunlight, the animals around you, the people in your community, and clever mechanical tricks using nothing but water, fire, and gravity. Compare that to today, where most of us are woken up by a jarring digital tone or a phone notification, completely divorced from sunlight, community, or our own internal rhythms. And you start to see why so many people struggle to wake up feeling genuinely rested, even with a perfectly accurate alarm clock sitting 3 feet from their head. Because here's the twist that ties this whole thing together. Modern sleep science has actually confirmed that a lot of ancient methods were, in some ways, working with the body rather than against it, even if the people using them had no idea why. Waking with sunlight, for instance, is now something sleep scientists actively recommend because gradually increasing light exposure in the morning helps regulate your circadian rhythm far more gently than a sudden loud noise does. There's an entire category of modern alarm clocks now called sunrise alarm clocks or wake-up light alarms that simulate a gradually brightening sunrise in your bedroom before playing any sound at all. Specifically because researchers found this leads to people waking up feeling less groggy and more alert. In other words, one of the most cutting-edge sleep technologies you can buy today is essentially a very expensive electronic reinvention of exactly what our ancestors were doing naturally with nothing but their bedroom window and the actual sun. There's also something to be said about the jarring, sudden noise most of us wake up to today, whether it's a blaring digital tone or a phone alarm. Waking up abruptly from deep sleep triggers something called sleep inertia, that groggy, disoriented feeling that can genuinely impair your reaction time and cognitive function for up to 30 minutes or more after waking. Ancient methods, ironically, were often gentler on this front. A rooster's crow builds gradually as multiple birds join in. A knocker-upper's tapping would typically start soft and increase until you responded. Water clocks and incense clocks, while they had a distinct triggering moment, were still operating within an environment governed by natural light gradually filling the room, rather than a pitch-black bedroom suddenly assaulted by a piercing electronic shriek at maximum volume. So in a weird way, by inventing louder, more aggressive, more efficient alarm systems, we may have actually made the experience of waking up worse for ourselves biologically, even while making it more precise and convenient in terms of raw scheduling. Ancient humans had a system that worked with their biology because they had no other choice. They were limited to sunlight, sound, and simple mechanics, all of which happen to align reasonably well with how our internal clocks actually function. We, on the other hand, have the technology to wake up however we want, and a lot of us have accidentally chosen options that work against our own biology rather than with it. There's one more layer to this story that's genuinely fascinating and rarely talked about, and it has to do with how differently ancient societies thought about time itself compared to how we do now. For most of human history, especially before mechanical clocks became widespread, time wasn't fixed in the way we experience it today. Many ancient and medieval societies used what's called temporal hours, where daylight was divided into 12 equal segments regardless of the actual season, meaning an hour in summer, with its longer days, was literally a longer chunk of time than an hour in winter. This system meant that waking up on time was inherently flexible and tied to the sun's actual position rather than a fixed, unchanging number on a clock face. It wasn't until mechanical clocks became widespread, and later the standardization of time zones in the 19th century, driven largely by the needs of railway schedules, that humanity shifted toward the rigid, fixed-hour system we live by today, where 7 a.m. means exactly the same duration of time whether it's June or December. This shift is honestly a bigger deal than it sounds like. It fundamentally changed the relationship between humans and the concept of on time. Ancient humans were, in a very real sense, waking up in sync with their environment, their bodies, and the natural rhythm of daylight. We now wake up in sync with an abstract, artificial, perfectly rigid system that has nothing to do with the actual sun outside our window, which is part of why so many of us feel like we're constantly fighting against our own bodies just to follow a schedule. So, when you really zoom out and look at this entire journey, from sunlight to roosters, from water clocks and incense sticks to monks with candles and rope fuses, from knocker-uppers with pea shooters to spring-driven mechanical clocks, and finally to the phone buzzing next to your pillow right now, what you're actually looking at is thousands of years of humans trying to solve one single, deceptively simple problem. How do you convince a biological creature, wired by millions of years of evolution to wake up gently with the sun, to instead wake up precisely when a schedule demands it? And honestly, when you frame it that way, our ancestors were remarkably successful. using nothing but observation, patience, and clever engineering. They figured out that roosters had internal clocks before anyone understood what a circadian rhythm even was. They figured out that gradually increasing light and sound worked better than sudden loud noises. Centuries before, sleep scientists proved it in a lab. They built devices that could measure and trigger events at precise moments using nothing but water, gravity, and fire. So the next time your alarm goes off and you groggily reach over to silence it, maybe give a small mental nod to the ancient Egyptian engineer who built a water clock to wake up Plato's students, or the monk who spent his entire night awake just so his brothers could pray on time, or the knocker-upper walking the freezing streets of industrial Britain with a stick, tapping window after window, making sure an entire neighborhood made it to their shift on time. Waking up on time has never actually been a simple problem. Not for us, and definitely not for them. We've just traded incense sticks and roosters for silicon chips and vibration motors, chasing the exact same goal our ancestors were chasing thousands of years before any of us were born. And if there's one thing this whole story proves, it's that no matter how advanced our technology gets, we're still fundamentally the same creatures we always were, biologically tethered to sunlight and rhythm, endlessly inventive when it comes to solving the very human, very ancient problem of getting our own stubborn bodies out of bed.